First one is about a very controversial issue, which is free trade, the ideology of free trade. I don't know if you were around 1988. There was a big debate, and the major parties were debating, and I think it was Mulroney then, when free trade in North America was brought in. And there were obviously pros and cons. The people that supported it says more business for Canada, better for the economy and all that. People that were opposing it were saying we're losing employment because the factories are closing here and opening where in third world countries where labor is cheaper and all that. And it's basically a constitution for the corporations to get the governments off their backs. That was the argument in those days. Now it has quieted down lately, and we're still on carrying free trade agreements with Europe and with China and with Israel and with many other countries. What is your opinion about free trade agreements in general?
Well, in general, free isn't free for anyone, but it's the corporations, it seems. What we need are fair trade systems, and the Green Party supports fair global trade. So when it comes down to free or fair, there's a big difference. So principles of global equity, Canadian sovereignty, human rights, and the environment, they have to be considered in these agreements, which we're finding they're not. In fact, people are getting further down on the list of priorities as corporations are gaining more and more control over us, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So what should we do with the existing trades?
Oh, well, we need to really be looking at those agreements. We're particularly concerned with investor-state agreements. These are going to make lawyers a lot of money as we find ourselves in situations where Canadians are not going to be able to say no to these big corporations. So we really need to look at these agreements. We need to go back and revisit some of these, and as a green government we would definitely be standing up against like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that's coming up. That is not in the best interests of Canadians. We're losing our sovereignty, as you mentioned, and it's because of these agreements. So the Green Party puts people and planet first, and as a result we need to be looking at a fair trade system, as I said, that looks at the principles of global equity, Canadian sovereignty, human rights, and the environment. Currently these systems aren't set up like this.
Would you consider abrogating any of the trade deals already signed?
Oh yes, absolutely. It might cost us a lot of money, but in the long run we're going to win our rights back, because this continues as it is. We are going to be completely at the mercy of these corporations.
Yeah, the Liberal Party has looked at both sides of the issues. As you say, sometimes we've said this agreement is not in the interests of Canada, and John Turner in 1984 fought a big fight against it, the free trade agreement with the United States and with Mexico. On the other hand, more recently we've looked at agreements and we've said, yes, this makes sense. For example, with Chile and other countries. So we look at them agreement by agreement. Our question is, do these meet the labor standards that we require in Canada? Or does it protect our workers enough? Environmental standards, are we paying attention to environmental standards and not just exporting our environmental problems to other jurisdictions? And also the economic interests at stake. You know, is this really in Canada's economic interest? So we look at it case by case and we make a decision.
So, and the latest one with Europe, are you in favor of that free trade agreement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes in these negotiations, and my background is in dispute resolution, you can't get everything that you want, and sometimes you have to give up here to get over there. And that's part of the negotiation process in these free trade agreements. But some of the more difficult ones, the European one, to me, looks like an agreement that is in Canada's interest. A more questionable one, and I think a more difficult one for the Liberal Party of Canada, has been the agreement with China, the investment agreement. Very long period of time, and the dispute resolution provisions really seem to affect our sovereignty. So those are the kinds of things that we need to look at and to question very carefully. Unfortunately, with the Conservative government, Many of these negotiations have been done in secret, and parliamentarians have not been involved in the consultation process, and they haven't been engaged in reviewing these agreements. So the record of the Harper Conservatives has been a very difficult one on free trade agreements.
So if those negotiations are done in secret, would you still support them?
You know, all negotiations that are on complex issues, constitutional issues in Canada, free trade agreements internationally, require a balance. Sometimes you need, when you're getting into the nitty-gritty, to have confidential negotiations. That's normal in legal disputes, it's normal in international relations, but at the right time, and this means early enough to make an informed decision, the government should come to Parliament, inform parliamentarians of what's happening in the negotiations, and allow a free and open debate around the pros and cons of these agreements. And unfortunately, with the Conservative government, that happens very, very late in the day.
Mm-hmm. When the Liberals were in power, did they have any free trade agreements that were also in secret?
You know, as I said earlier, there's always an element in these negotiations, constitutional negotiations and free trade agreements, where part of it is done in secret, part of it is debated in Parliament. And our point is, it's legitimate to negotiate in secret, but come back to Parliament in an open way and allow a free and informed debate.
Are you comfortable with the panel of settlements? Like when there's a dispute, they're not the governments that get into litigation, but industry.
That's right.
Groups that that have priority over the rules or the laws of any country.
It's a very serious concern, especially that large foreign corporations, say Monsanto or others, can come into Canada and have dispute resolution provisions that Canadian companies don't have. That's a serious issue, and we need to pay attention to how that's being negotiated, especially since, as you say, what we're doing is giving away part of our sovereignty, often to very well-paid international lawyers and arbitrators who run these dispute resolution panels, not Canadians generally from foreign countries. And so that's a real concern. How much sovereignty are we giving up, and how much are we favoring foreign multinational corporations in this process?
Right, right.
Well, the NDP has always supported fair trade agreements. And when you label them free trade agreements, sometimes you're into the area of ideology, and there's a lot of other things that get dragged into the agreements. So our concern has been that any agreements we sign make sure that there are protocols respecting labor rights, human rights, and the environment. So those should be part of any consideration in any trade agreement. And of course, we've always said we stand very firmly behind those marketing agreements that protect our food production here in Canada. And personally, I've always been a very strong supporter of things that enhance local food security. So quite often those things that are called free trade agreements have some serious challenges in the areas of environment, human rights, and food security.
Mm-hmm. There was a group of people that wanted actually to abrogate the existing free trades. Your position is that you would review a few chapters. You are not in the position of completely getting away from the already existing free trade agreement.
Well, many of the agreements that the Harper government signed have locked Canada in for a very long time and will have very severe consequences in trying to get out of them. But we would have to look at those on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm. Did they have a 6-month clause where they could cancel, give notice of cancellation?
Some have 6-month clauses in them. Others have longer. And the investment agreement with China, which both the Conservatives and the Liberals supported, has a 30-year time frame in it, with a very long time before you can get out of that agreement. So as I said, we'd have to look at a case-by-case basis at those agreements.
We've been looking at those cases for how many years? Now, since '88?
Well, I don't know how long you've been looking at them.
Well, I know that we've been looking at them, and every election day I talk to politicians, and usually they say, we have to look into it. We will look chapter by chapter. Liberals and NDPs usually say the same thing. We will look into it. But the question is, what can you do about it? If you don't agree with the existing free trade agreements, what could you do about it?
Well, as I said, you have to review each of those one by one. But I would like to say that the big difference is that the Liberals have supported all of the so-called free trade agreements, whereas the NDP has only supported 2 of those agreements over time, where we felt that labor standards, environmental standards have been given due consideration, and that they didn't have excessive investor-state protections in them. So it's not the same between the NDP and the Liberals. There is quite a big difference on the trade agreements.
Okay.
Well, the Green Party is in favor of trade because trade is essential for a country. but we're calling for fair trade, not necessarily free trade. And you referenced the NAFTA agreement. We actually fought an election on that agreement. We knew what was in it. We've had more experience with it since. So I would say there are some things in the NAFTA agreement that we should be revisiting. But the current so-called free trade agreements, I don't think are free trade agreements. I think they're investor-state agreements. And there's a big difference between a free trade agreement and an investor-state agreement. So we're talking here about FTA, which was the agreement with China, with the Korea-Canada agreement, with the current agreement that's being negotiated, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The trouble with these agreements is that they're agreements that are first of all being negotiated in secret. Canadians are not being asked, is this what you want in a free trade agreement? So they're also too long. They're tying the hands of government for 20 and 30 years. The FTA agreement with China ties the Canadian government's hands for more than 30 years. And there is very little ability to get out of it without paying great sums of money. So we need agreements that we can revisit, and we need to take the secrecy away. So those are, our party is in favor of trade, and we're in favor of trade agreements, but they're agreements that should be open. They should have clauses that allow us to revisit them, and they should be agreements between countries, because my final objective is we give away our sovereignty in these free trade agreements. And I think we need to have agreements that benefit countries, including Canada, and not just large profit-making corporations.
Mm-hmm. Should we have a plebiscite on free trade agreements?
Well, we did have one. We called it an election. And I think that's the sort of fight we should have, where people are allowed to ask questions and hear the arguments and talk to politicians about what they believe.
Well, absolutely. For working class people, they're nothing but bad. In terms of our sovereignty, every time we make a free trade agreement, we sacrifice some of our sovereignty. These free trade agreements, they're capitalist trade pacts that undermine and supersede locally determined policy decisions. And like in terms of the environment, this puts us in a terrible position because it's corporate profit that's going to win out against in the environment every time. It's the Communist Party's position that Canada needs to pull out of NATO, of NAFTA, and of CETA, and certainly the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Yeah, it's been terrible for Canada's manufacturing sector as well.
So you would advocate for the abrogation of existing free trade agreements?
Absolutely. Canada needs an independent trade policy.
Mm-hmm.